So let's take a closer look then, shall we, at the papers. Steve Richards, Ella Whelan are here. Plenty of them focusing on what's going to happen from lunchtime tomorrow, which is a debate and then vote on this new tier system. The Tories in revolt, Labour abstaining. So let's start. Steve, Daily Telegraph. Does it matter for the Prime Minister? I mean, he obviously wants people to accept the tiers. Do you think the revolt by Tory MPs amplifies to people how tough this is for all of them?
Well, it matters on many levels, not the practical one, because Labour abstaining means the proposals will go through, however big the Tory revolt. But when you get these revolts or threats of revolt, I think it tells you something about a loss of authority in Number 10. We're in the midst of another fairly wacky sequence. So, for example, on Saturday, you had Michael Gove writing a really good piece, in my view, a long essay in the Times, explaining why these tiers were in place and the reasoning behind it. By Saturday evening, you had a sort of panic-stricken letter from Boris Johnson to MPs, at least contradicting the tone of the Gove piece and in some ways the substance too. But that didn't have the impact he wanted, because these MPs are still being very muscular. And this muscularity on the backbenches always happens when there is a sort of breakdown in the confidence of backbenchers with the operation in Number 10. So even though this will get through tomorrow night, I think it's quite significant that there will be a rebellion and that Labour are abstaining, because they too then have the space to be more critical of these constraints. I mean, they're in favour of constraints, rightly so, but not necessarily some of these. They've voted for them in the past. So I do think it's a difficult moment for Boris Johnson, even though he's going to get his way tomorrow night.
Yes, The Guardian talking about Labour. Labour delivers a blow to Johnson's COVID plan as Tory rebels circle. I don't know about you, Ella. You sort of get the impression they're not all singing from the Libertarian hymn sheet. Some are just concerned that the decision to lump large areas into tiers needs to be examined more closely. Is that fair, do you think, that they're worried that they might have a really low level, but somewhere in their county has a really high level? So presumably the hospitals are put at risk. But what's your assessment of the rebels here?
Well, no, you don't have to be a paid-up libertarian to have some serious issues with what the government is doing. I mean, you don't even have to be a lockdown skeptic. I think most people rightly agree, as Steve says, that this is a serious virus and we need to take measures to protect people from catching it, vulnerable people from potentially dying from it. But I mean, the question of this official report that basically seems to have been a bit of a copy and paste job on the impact of the new tiers and the attempt at economic forecasting, attempt being the important word, has rightly been ridiculed by some of these Tory rebels, because the government's pretty much come out and said, well, we know it's going to have the economy's going to take a hit. We know it's going to have some consequences, but you kind of can't really forecast that. So never mind. Just go along with this tier system, which, let's remember, is basically for most of the country an extension of lockdown. That just won't do. I mean, I agree with one of the reasonings from Keir Starmer's decision to abstain, to whip to abstain tomorrow, is that in the space of the lockdown that we've just had, you would have hoped that the government had got some kind of plan together or upped its game in terms of testing, or taken the breathing space that lockdown was supposed to be, it was billed as, to better our approach in the coming months, and not just have this continual kind of reliance on lockdown and release. But that's pretty much the only game in town at the moment. There is no alternative strategizing. There is, if you question the idea that this whole process doesn't seem to be working, which it doesn't. We have a fluctuation in the R rate, and Matt Hancock coming out today saying that there's been, great numbers coming out, that the infection rate is down. But we all know that once that is released, then they're going to shoot up again. So this kind of cycle keeps running. So no, you don't have to be a libertarian. You don't even have to really be that rebellious to see that this isn't the kind of game that the government is playing isn't very convincing at the moment. And Steve is right. They're scrabbling around for authority and can't quite find it.
I mean, you don't think the figures that Matt Hancock quoted today are convincing? He quoted the Imperial College study showing that cases have dropped by a third, 14,700 new cases now compared to a peak of 25,300 on the 16th of November. Hospital admissions down as well. Last week, cases alone dropped by 30%. It sounds quite convincing, does it not? And I mean, Boris Johnson made quite clear last week that this is not an extension of the lockdown. Retail spaces are open, places of worship are open, gyms are open, etc. So it isn't the same as just continuing rolling lockdown, is it, if you're in tier 3?
No, I'm not suggesting that it's not convincing in terms of, I don't think Matt Hancock is, pulling these out of his armpit. But there is a lot of bad faith going on in the discussion around this, which is that, yes, we know that a hard lockdown in this kind of nature that we've had, and let's remember, in some parts of the UK they've had for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks, has an effect on getting numbers better in terms of the virus because you're stopping people from seeing each other. But the minute you release, the numbers shoot up again. So it's like playing a game of cat and mouse. That's the thing I'm questioning. And let's be real here. There might be some releases in terms of a couple of shops being open, but for the vast majority of people, still not being able to see people inside or outside in varying numbers and being restricted on where you can go out in pubs and restaurants and that kind of thing, life carries on pretty much as it has done in the miserable way it has done for the last few weeks. So I wish the government would just be a bit more open and honest about really the sacrifices it's asking us to make. And then actually the important point is that would be the way to continue public morale and maintain a good relationship of trust, not between Tory rebels and the government, but between the public and the government.
See, what's interesting is that the way you get authority in Number 10, remember, they've got the buttress of a 80-plus majority. I mean, Theresa May would have died for that kind of figure. But you get authority by establishing an argument that seems to be consistently applied. Instead, you're quite right. I mean, we're in lockdown, so the figures are coming down. But as Ella suggests, when we're out of it, if we're out of it in some places, it'll start going up again. And there seems to be an erratic pattern in place. So Christmas is a bit of a free-for-all, even though the virus won't recognise Christmas. In the build-up to that, Boris Johnson has hinted that others are going to be in lower tiers. But then there will be this Christmas period when it will go up again. And so there hasn't been a consistently applied set of principles and arguments that you appear to be implementing, at least with a degree of forward thinking and consistency. And in that kind of vacuum of contradictory messaging, MPs understandably say, right, they clearly don't know what they're doing. We'll try and take some control. Now, in fairness to the government, this was always going to happen when you stop a national lockdown and become more selective of who gets what, because those who feel victimised are going to complain about it, and MPs will feel the need to vote with their constituents rather than with the government. So it is tough. But as I say, I think it arises from this really kind of wacky pattern we're going through at the moment and this free-for-all at Christmas.
So, well, I'm going to come on to Rita Ora and the question of individual responsibility in just a moment. But let's go to the Sun, first of all. 10 pints of lager and a Scotch egg, please. This was the Environment Minister, George Eustice, suggesting that actually a Scotch egg does count as a substantial meal, which was somewhat knocked back by the Downing Street press team afterwards. But you talked about a consistent message, Steve. It's hard to get a consistent message when a Scotch egg... well, I'm not sure it's a substantial meal or a bar snack, but anyway, this is the level of debate we're up against, isn't it?
I can't stand it. I mean, I'm completely discriminated against. I will now vote against the government. I can't bear Scotch eggs. And if you think about it, to justify a meal where you're there for ages, you have to eat about 25 of them. So this, again, is a kind of silly part of this rather bizarre sequencing of messages.
Yeah, that's the new Christmas competition, I think. Ella, go on.
But it is ridiculous. And obviously the whole point about this question of substantial meals at pubs everyone is talking anecdotally about the fact that they're going to order a meal, eat it over the space of 4 hours once it's stone cold. So you may as well eat 25 Scotch eggs rather than picking your way through a cold fish and chips. But it's this kind of ridiculous. This is the ridiculousness of where we're at with the reliance on government kind of nitpicking into the most tiny sort of choices that we make in our lives. I mean, to not be able to trust people to make sensible decisions when you're in a pub, what is the necessity to eat while you're in a pub? Why does that stop the virus? It's kind of the same thing as when there was this sort of fuss over where there was going to be an official government pronouncements on whether people should wear jumpers at Christmas if you had to open the windows. I mean, it's just that kind of thing that makes people feel ticked off about this whole situation, because it's like, do they think we're children? Do they think we can't make these kinds of sensible decisions? And it's that kind of undermining of the public's ability to have a role in this battle against the virus, a sensible role, and be trusted, that is really not good for the collective sense of solidarity in beating this thing.
I disagree with Ella about this. I mean, I don't think people can be trusted in pubs because once you've had 10 Scotch eggs and 25 pints, you're in a different place. And you're probably in a really bad place, actually, when I think about it. But this thing is raging. And therefore, I support the idea of constraining what people can do in pubs and when. I mean, Wales, I heard today, are going to make pubs close at 6 p.m. and things like that. Now, maybe that's more sensible than to say we can go to a pub if you knock back 40 Scotch eggs. But I think they do have to impose a degree of constraint during this period.
It's all experimental. Nobody really knows what works. You've got to keep trying different things, isn't? That's where you get this piecemeal thing that everyone gets confused by. But this is not evidence-based medicine, is it? It's just let's see what works. Let's see what the result might be. Ella, I'm going to move on if you don't mind. The Metro does talk about the Scotch egg in quite a funny way as well. If we just see that to minister, this pub meal is substantial right at the top there. But it's Rita Ora and the what was she thinking moment, which is we come on to next, has a party, invites people in a restaurant that should be closed. Ella, what do you think?
I mean, this always happens. This is, it's the privilege, to use that kind of much controversial word, of the rich and famous to be able to get around these kind of laws. I'm not shocked. Anyone who's shocked at this needs to get out more. This is what happens. I don't really go in for the kind of the gotcha nature of this kind of thing because people break rules and she shouldn't have been doing that, and you can criticize her. But I think there's the thing that I don't like, which runs alongside it, is this kind of the kind of hyper moralizing around the virus. So the idea that Rita Ora is killing people by doing this, is putting people's lives in danger. Obviously, we know that mixing at this time presents a risk for the virus spreading, and yes, that inevitably does put people's lives in danger, and that's why it's very important to emphasize the social aspect of our fight against this, that it isn't just an individual.
But it's more that people are losing their businesses, it's more that people are sacrificing absolutely everything, isn't it? I mean, even Dominic Cummings was trying to save his family when they were all ill. She's just out having a good time, and and Steve,
but she's a celebrity. She's a celebrity. They do this kind of rubbish.
I mean, the fact that she's a celebrity doesn't give her permission to do these things. And in fact, it is, I think, more helpful for her to be put on the front pages in this way, because otherwise you just think, oh, well, if she's doing it, we can do it. And you can't. I mean, one thing, when you said we're making it up as we go along, well, to some extent, but one thing everybody is agreed with is social distancing makes a difference. And you can't social distance if you're dancing the night away in a restaurant that should be closed. So we do know that. And if they have to be made an example of, better that than to be sort of glamorized and to therefore legitimize all of us going out and rocking the night away, because that, we know, is a way in which this thing will spread.
We will have plenty more in the next part of our programme, including the collapse of Sir Philip Green's Arcadia Retail Group. Which shop would you miss the most? Back with that in just a moment. Oh, hurrah, you're back. There we go. Let's go to Arcadia. Heralded, I guess, since the end of last week, but some much-loved stores for people, big questions about Sir Philip Green, obviously. Ella, what do you make of this? The pandemic is so tough for retail, isn't it, as we know?
It is, but I think the main point that actually most of the coverage of the story is pointing to is that, yes, coronavirus has been, and the lockdown and shutting down these stores have been a catalyst for the downfall of the Arcadia Group, but it has not been the root cause. And I mean, Philip Green has form here when it comes to this kind of situation. We know that there's been controversy about the kind of moves business moves that he's made in the past, the kind of dividends he's given his wife, his penchant for taking businesses like this to the wall, and being very expert at kind of managing and massaging debt. So there's a question there on how much he is to blame in all of this. But also there's the wider trend of the, coronavirus or no coronavirus, the changing nature of the high street, the way in which certain shops, like as the FT mentions, Topshop, haven't been able to compete with online stores like Boohoo, the changing nature of shopping, all of that. And ultimately, the question is what happens to these 13,000 workers whose jobs are on the line. The FT is reporting that there's not any immediate planned redundancies, that there are going to be questions about whether or not it can be saved. But this is not good news for the thousands of people that work in retail. And while coronavirus has a big role to play in that, and the government's restrictions have a big role to play in that, ultimately the question lies at why are we back here again? This is at the same record that we've heard before when it comes to Philip Green and his mismanagement of businesses.
Yes, and that fundamental shift in the way we shop. I mean, aside from Sir Philip Green, all the questions about how he paid his wife a dividend more than he bought the whole company for, and et cetera, is what do we do about our towns and cities? If all these stores are going, why do we go in there? Why do we go and shop, and we can't just go for a coffee now? The whole changing face of the way we live, Steve. These are really big questions now.
I know it's a cliche that the pandemic is accelerating things that were happening anyway, but some cliches are true, and I think this one is true. We were all talking about the future of the high street before the pandemic, and we're going to be talking about it a huge amount during Look at Us Tonight and after the pandemic. I mean, I'm picking up all the time evidence of some of the big shops getting as much online trade as they did when they were open pre the latest lockdown and so on. And this, I think, will be a permanent change. There's quite a good leader in the FT, in tomorrow's FT, saying this was going to happen anyway. It might have speeded up because of all these changing patterns. But you're right, there then is a broader question, Steve, about what replaces.
You'll have to tell me at 11:30. I'm sorry, we've run out of time. Okay. What replaces ... We'll see them then. So let's get the thoughts then of Steve Richards and Ella Whelan. Welcome to both of you. To the Times we start. Ella, the secret dossier on COVID damage. Tell us more.
Yes, so we've had the official impact assessment or report or investigation, whatever you want to call it, that has been quite widely ridiculed by Tory MPs that the government has produced, in which it hashed together a few bits of data from here and there, copy and pasted some from somewhere else, and came to the conclusion that you couldn't really forecast that much about the economic impact of the planned restrictions, the tiered system. But there is this, as the Times reports, secret dossier, which is basically a kind of working dashboard that Whitehall officials use, using quite basic raw data to predict, on the basis of a traffic light system, red, amber and green, which sectors will be hit worse, which sectors are not doing very well, and what a kind of a forecasting, a general wide, big brushstrokes forecasting. And the interesting and damning thing for the government is that, of course, this obviously does exist. They do have some manner of sense of what the economic impact is going to be. I mean, of course, Rishi Sunak does, because we know that he's constantly trying to argue often a largely different route, a more lenient route than Matt Hancock or others in government. But they are making a choice to not make this information public, to not give the public, or actually even their own MPs, the full picture, because they are worried that this will not play well into the strategy that they're using, which is basically arguing that lockdown is the only way to go. presumably the government thinks that the minute you start being honest with the public and saying, OK, we're going to lock down, we're going to have these restrictions, tiered restrictions, if you want to call them that, though I think a lot of people do experience this as just an extension of lockdown. But that means that hospitality, as the Times reports, things like arts and culture, the automotive industry might well go to the wall. Is that a price we're willing to take? That question really hasn't been debated, and that is a very big issue. But it's also the case that we know that we're living in a kind of a bit of a bubble at the moment in terms of, especially in terms of employment and job losses, because the furlough scheme sort of rather artificially keeping a lot of jobs in play. And we know when that ends that there's going to be a massive amount of cuts. We know that there's a lot of young people who are at the moment in limbo who would otherwise be making up unemployment figures. There's our crises yet to come. And so that's why it really is very necessary for the government to be upfront about this, because fingers crossed we get out of the immediate danger of the pandemic once a vaccine comes and we've all got Easter in our head as a time potentially to look forward to. But the consequences of this lockdown and the restrictions that we've had over the last 9 months will not end in Easter. In fact, we haven't even started seeing them get going yet. And that's why I think this kind of living in bad faith and not giving the public, let alone your own MPs, the full picture is a really damaging way for the government to go.
I mean, some of it's a bit obvious, isn't it? If you think about it, the sectors, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of them. The sectors in this red rating are aerospace, the automotive industry, retail, hospitality and tourism, arts and heritage, maritime, including ferries and cruises and sports. It's all obvious. They're really struggling, isn't it? It's not like they're hiding some great secret. Let's go to the Daily Telegraph, Steve, shall we? Tories in revolt over the Prime Minister's tiers for various reasons. Some are simply against the fact you're being told when you cannot see your family. The likes of Sir Graham Brady, for example. Others are just confused why they are listed in Tier 3 when they've got some of the lowest cases in England. So there's various reasons why certain Tory MPs are not happy with this.
There are various reasons, and if you impose a tier system, there are going to be these issues. But if you kind of step back one kind of metre or foot from the immediate drama of the Tory looming revolt, we all knew the lockdown would have to end. All hell would have broken loose if the national lockdown in England had been extended. And at the same time, we all knew rightly there couldn't just be a free-for-all where all the constraints were lifted. So therefore, the tier system was the only likely and feasible option. But I think what has happened is that Boris Johnson has panicked to some extent, tried to appease these MPs, failed to do so. MPs detect weakness in his approach and a certain inconsistency and incoherence, at least in tone, with Michael Gove on Saturday writing a powerful essay in the Times in favour of the tiered system and their approach. Boris Johnson then sort of panicking at the signs of revolt, writing letters saying, well, you'll all be out of this tier and all this kind of thing. And it's always in these kind of areas where MPs detect weakness that they make their moves. Their moves aren't, in my view, wholly reasonable because there do have to be these constraints. And if you lift them, we know what happens. But I think it's part of this broader, slightly erratic picture. So everything's going to be lifted more or less for the Christmas period. It's going to be very tough for some people from Tuesday onwards, having experienced the national lockdown. And then they too will have this period of freedom, which will in itself create problems going into that rather dark period in January. So it's a kind of very erratic set of messages. And in that kind of inconsistency, I think they are flexing their muscles.
Yes,
and even though the government's going to win, it's difficult for them when you have a revolt on this kind of scale, Labour abstaining for different reasons than the Tory rebels. It's problematic, even though it's guaranteed they'll be implemented after the vote.
Yes, apologies. I was just going to say that this paper says upwards of 40 Tory MPs are expected to rebel. I mean, some nearer to 70 have expressed some concerns about the tiers for various reasons, haven't they, I suppose? Let's go on to the Daily Mail, shall we? Which is another interesting area about how you control or cajole people to get what you want, which is obviously uptake of the vaccine. The suggestion today from the minister now in charge of the vaccine rollout that there might be some sort of immunity passport idea where you can't come to a venue if you can't show you've got the vaccine. What do you make of the idea in principle, Ella?
I think this is a really bad idea, and I am a big fan of the vaccine. I think that everyone should get it when they are able to get it. No question about that. But I'm involved in a debating championship called Debating Matters as a judge that I've been doing on Zoom for the last few weeks, and we've often had two schools pitted against each other arguing over whether vaccination should be made compulsory. And they, Nadhim Zahawi and these other ministers need to kind of listen to the kids that I'm talking to, because it's very clear to anyone that in the current situation where you have a big problem with mistrust, you've got a big problem with, not necessarily vast swathes of the population buying into conspiracy theories, but a huge amount of cynicism around what's happening. And the idea that you would then basically have forced vaccinations by the back door. OK, the government's admitted they can't pin down people and stick a needle in their arm, but doing it through the manner of fines or through restrictions or through having to have what's been called kind of so-called vaccine passports is coercion in a different way. And the much, much better, much more effective way of doing this is by having a very detailed approach to getting the vaccine out into the community. So having targeted healthcare workers that go into different communities and talk to people and explain to them why this is necessary, why they should get it, and win the argument with the public on that basis. It's a much better, much more effective, I think much more politically sound way of dealing with this. And it is a fantastic thing. The vaccine is such an exciting piece of news, especially the fact that it's been turned around so quickly. There's, you should be celebrating the human innovation that's gone behind this. But to then damage that by suggesting that it's going to be this kind of really quite sneaky but coercive way of dealing with this is so wrong. I think that they're really deluded in thinking this is the right way to go about it.
But if you're not persuaded by roughly 450 deaths a day on average, even during a second lockdown, then maybe you'll never be persuaded, and you need something to tempt you, especially perhaps younger people who are less likely to be very seriously affected by the virus itself. Might need to just be persuaded that you can get your life back on track if you take one. Steve, what do you think then?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're right that maybe some young people, well, Ella seems to have, met some who are resistant to forms of coercion, this isn't a coercion in a way. It's a sort of saying, look, get it, and then you'll have access to these places. We need people to take the vaccine when the time comes. And I think you're right. If evidence of these deaths don't persuade people that it's worth taking the vaccine, you might have to use kind of mechanisms for them to do so, because otherwise they will, even if they're fine themselves, they might continue to spread it to others who also are resistant in taking the vaccine. And this is so important as a means through this nightmare that I do think the government has to consider mechanisms. I mean, if you listen to the debate about the lockdown measures or the ones to come, people say, why are we having any of this? Why can't we just get on more or less as before? Look at the United States or indeed Sweden. This virus spreads without constraints. So when the vaccine comes, I think we do have to consider options like the one being raised in that Mail front page.
I'm pausing because, Ella, you wanted to come in throughout whatever Steve was...
I just think that it's a cynical, I'm worried that it's a cynical way of dealing with the public, this kind of, carrot and stick attitude that really all people are going to, and especially young people, this kind of generalization that they're really only thinking about themselves. But actually, I mean, I know I'm not one to support any reliance on polls, because we know polls could be wrong, but there is a general sense that people want to understand the seriousness of this virus, that they want to, they agree with some manner of restrictions, they want to get out of this, and that it is a challenge. It is a serious political challenge for the government to communicate the necessity of this virus, the necessity of this vaccination to beat the virus. But you shouldn't wimp out of that and rely on basically what is kind of a mild form of coercion. There's lots of important factors to take into consideration, in relation to
Ella,
different vaccinations with religious people not wanting to take it. All those things are in play and should be part of a debate. It shouldn't be this kind of means of treating people sort of like idiots, like you have to force them into doing it rather than trusting them to make the right decision.
Sorry to butt in. I just very quickly wanted to do the Scotch egg, which is what is a substantial meal, which goes down to, should you live with what the the rules are suggesting, or should you try and just push them each time? And it's a bit like that, isn't it, really, that, you know, a lot of the newspapers have gone, a Scotch egg, please, Gov, and 15 pints, or 25, as I think you said earlier, Steve. Just very quickly, this story.
Yeah, well, apparently, if you have a Scotch egg, that's counted as a meal, and then you can stay at the pub. You know, on the basis you've got to have a meal while you're having the 15 pints. And I think you probably will have to have about 25 Scotch eggs to span the time of the 15 pints. And I just dread to think what state people will be in at the end of that. You know, I can't bear Scotch eggs. So for me, this is an ordeal, like the vaccine is for some. But you can see how kind of weird things are going to go on in this next phase as to how you justify what you're doing. And in Wales, they've simplified it. They haven't gone the Scotch egg option. They just said pubs should close at 6, which is, again, an interesting contrast.
Indeed so. Some people don't eat much, you see. You've got to make rules for everybody, haven't you? That's the difficulty with this. Plenty more still to come, including more of the biggest names on the high street could be about to disappear. But we'll discuss the collapse of Arcadia after this break. Well, welcome back. You're watching the press preview. With me now, Steve Richards and Ella Whelan. Welcome back to both of you. To the front page of the Financial Times now, Steve. Much heralded, but still, you know, very sad for all the fans of the stores, not to mention the staff, that Arcadia has collapsed into administration. All the questions about the changing high street and questions about Sir Philip Green, obviously, as well.
Yeah, and 13,000 jobs at risk, which is another frightening figure in the midst of this pandemic. But as the FT says in its leader tomorrow morning, this was in a way accelerating the trend that had already started to take place with so much shopping done online now. And so I know it's a cliche, but it happens to be true in this case, that the pandemic has accelerated the trends that were already taking place. And I know a lot of shops are experiencing this sort of weird thing where they find that they're selling as much online in this lockdown period as they were prior to it when they were open in various forms. And if shops can't adapt to that, they're going to get into real trouble, as we're seeing with these ones. But there are wider questions that you raise about the future of the high street and what form it's going to take. There will be many of these questions post-pandemic. But this, in a way, is one of the more urgent ones because the trend had already begun. And so it raises immediate questions about whether any of the jobs can be saved, whether there might be others interested in buying some of that empire. But in the longer term, it's about the future of retail as it has been for so many years.
Yes, whether it's bought for the brand, goes online, stores closed, jobs lost. Those are the questions, aren't they? Just 1 minute left. Yeah. Ella, front page story of The Guardian about the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Tell us more.
Yeah, there's been a lot of controversy around this and what different board members have been getting up to. And this particular story is about the fact that one board member has liked social media posts criticising Black Lives Matter and done things as terrible as also liked social media posts describing words like misogynist and homophobe as highly ideological propaganda terms, and basically liked a few things on social media which might upset some people who are more, to use that awful phrase, right on, you know, negating the idea that you can be very much in favour of equality and against racism and all those sort of things and disagree with official campaigns like Black Lives Matter, or indeed raise questions about the overuse of the term misogynist, which lots of, you know, people who are for women's liberation like me also do. But the kind of funny thing about this is this sort of policing of what officials do on social media. And I'm reminded of the fact that I think it was a number of weeks ago, whoever runs the Pope's official account was caught liking pictures of scantily clad Brazilian models, should I put it that way? So maybe there needs to be some kind of training among certain sections of people to know that people can see what you like on social media, or maybe we all need to relax a little bit.
Absolutely. Ella, loving the tree, by the way. Ella Whelan, Steve Richards, thank you very much indeed. We will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.